Okay. Well, hello, I'm Lee Barrett from Lancaster Theological Seminary, with which Gary has a lot of connections. And today, we're going to start a 3-week series on issues related to life beyond death, resurrection, also known as going to heaven. And I'm going to do this because since the 1950s, there's been a documented sharp decline in preaching or even talking about life beyond death. That theme is dragged out for Easter and funerals, but often that's it. One of my colleagues at Franklin and Marshall did an actual statistical study of this and discovered that in any given year, from 1930 to 1950, about 90% of the sermons preached in Protestant churches had something to do with life beyond death. And then with the 1950s, that sharply declined till by the 1970s, at least in the Protestant main line, it was almost non-existent. So one of the things I'd like to ask you before we get rolling is, why do you think that happened? Why do you think focus on life beyond death, which had been crucial before the 1950s, became kind of marginalized after the 1950s? And any theories? There's no right or wrong answer, by the way.
People are living longer? That's my thought.
People are living longer. Let me just elaborate on that. That's been one proposal, that the fact that medical science can prolong life gives people the impression that with the help of technology, you can live indefinitely. So that, and also, death happens off camera. My grandmother died in my parents' living room, but that's unusual these days. Usually people pass away in hospitals, hospices. It's very rare to be walking down the street and find a dead body lying there. And that used to be common before the 20th century. So there is the sort of marginalization of death. You know, people don't like to think about it, and you get the impression that if you eat the right kind of diet, you know, and avoid saturated fats, you know, and jog and take enough vitamin B12, that you can prolong your life indefinitely. So that's one theory. Anything else?
How about World War II, the ending of World War II and that whole turbulent time?
Yeah, with the advent of the memory of the war, which was horrific, and the advent of the Cold War, people began to not focus upon their own personal demise, but the obliteration of the entire globe. Remember air raid shelters and air raid drills and stocking up in your bomb shelter, because the prospect of nuclear destruction was real. So people began to think more about the future of the planet and the race than what would happen to them post-mortem as individuals. Anything else?
As time went on, there seemed to be, after World War II, there seemed to be more and more distractions, especially with the computer age, and so you're starting to think about other things, and automobiles and so forth.
Yeah, that might be a factor too. Life got better. Life on Earth got better. People enjoyed it more. One major factor is the advent of anesthesia, or even like aspirin. It was estimated by one historian that before the 20th century, most human beings spent 70% of their lives in physical pain, because there was nothing you could do about it. No Tylenol, no aspirin, no ibuprofen. If you had a toothache, live with it. The only anesthesia was alcohol. You know, and and if you had to drink lots of whiskey, well, you folks are Presbyterians, so lots of scotch, preferably single malt. But even that would give you a hangover, and you'd feel worse. So people before the 20th century thought of life as on earth as something painful, and of course would long for another kind of existence that was pain-free. And life, there was more amusement. If something was troubling you, if you got a bad medical diagnosis, or one of your relatives got a bad diagnosis, there were always distractions. Go to a movie, turn on television. These days, go online. So it was always, so we had a culture of distraction so that folk would not think about their own mortality all that much.
Well, in the same vein, I think it was penicillin that was developed
42.
really, with World War II. And childhood diseases became less prevalent. Polio disappeared gradually. So folks weren't, as you say, really looking at people who were dying.
I think that's right. Yeah, and that continued. The pharmaceutical solution to a lot of diseases and surgical solution to a lot of diseases, that continued to escalate throughout the late 20th century, which is why I think COVID was such a shock. You know, here's something we don't know how to deal with. We don't have a cure for it. Maybe we can get vaccinated and prevent it somewhat, but we don't have a cure for it.
I was going to expand on the penicillin and the aspirin. It's medical science as a whole.
Yeah.
You know, going into a hospital for different, more than just to have your appendix taken out
Right.
nowadays. So.
Right.
I think there's also been a destruction in what the intimacy of family. We now, our families distribute all over the nation, whereas when you lived in a tighter society, part of the death and life after is the constant memory of that person that you lost. Now they're on the other side of the planet,
Right.
that you haven't seen for how many years, and so as you said, death has become invisible.
Right.
They're gone, so what? You don't have that relationship that keeps them ever present in your mind.
Right. It's different if someone dies whom you saw every morning at the breakfast table,
Yeah.
than if your cousin dies whom you haven't seen in 5 years, because they live in Spain.
Yeah.
Anything else? Well, these are all very valid, and sociologists have proposed all these things. And I also think that, and this is related to what we've already said, part of it was reaction against what was regarded as the otherworldliness of prior generations of Christians from the 19th century and early 20th century. The pie in the sky by and by. Life is bad on earth, so I'm just going to put up with it, grit my teeth, and try to get through it, and there will be a reward later. There will be pearly gates with streets of gold, and that's what I'm waiting for. To the neglect of making the world a better place, or even trying to improve your own life. So there was a reaction in the 20th century against the Victorian focus on heaven. Just that focus on heaven from the late 19th, early 20th century. Go to cemeteries and look at tombstones from like the end of the Civil War through the 1930s. Almost all of them are about escaping from this vale of tears and going to a better place. And often they have angels. It's the golden age of putting angels on tombstones, either in relief or statues of angels, often sleeping angels or angels with open arms. And went along with the notion of Christianity is about escaping from the horrors of this life, the sorrows, the miseries, life is bad, to another dimension where we will experience beatitude and absolute happiness. Well, thank you for those observations. Another thing, one thing I didn't mention was also, and it tracks with the rise of medical science, the rise of the scientific worldview. And folk finding speculation about some other dimension as being sort of superstitious or primitive. And as cognitive science developed the notion that our consciousness is tied to physiological brain states, that events in our neurological system, in our heads, are responsible for our consciousness, so that when there's no cortical activity, there's nothing. So the rise of science and everything has a material explanation, I think also contributed to that, where notion in an afterlife just seemed to be a relic of another period, a much more superstitious, supernaturalistic period. So you add all that together, I think it's understandable that mainline Protestants in their corporate life, in their worship, in their preaching, and their teaching, shifted to things like social problems, making the world a better place, making society a better place, or how to enrich your own life, how to live more fully and in a much more satisfying way in this life on earth. And what's beyond death got marginalized. In fact, it's bad manners to bring it up in many circles. When have you been to a dinner party or a dinner and said, well, what do you think about death? You'd probably regard it as, you forgot to take your medication that morning, or something traumatic had happened to you. But there's a problem with this, I think, and this is just myself. Sociologists of religion, who study religion globally, many of them have concluded, including the great sociologist of religion, Peter Berger, that religions catch on and flourish and survive and prosper because they deal with ultimate questions that trouble people. And those big questions are, why were we born? Why is there anything here? Why does the universe exist? And more particularly, why do we exist? And what happens when you die? And then the other question is, what are you supposed to be doing in between birth and death? And then if religion doesn't try to deal with those questions or answer them, then that religion eventually fades out. It doesn't grip people's imaginations or their hearts because it's not dealing with the things that are most deeply rooted in their spirits, even if they're trying to avoid those questions. And we do live in a culture now of escapism and general avoidance of serious issues. But they're still there. Might not think much about what is death all about until someone dies in your immediate circle or you get an unfortunate diagnosis, but then you can't avoid it. So it's always there haunting us in the back of our minds. And personally, I think that part of the evident decline in the Protestant mainline churches in the United States, but Derry's exempt from this. You're doing something right. But most churches are in sharp decline, denominations are in decline, and I think it's because they're not addressing the big questions, including, is there anything beyond death? If so, what can we hope for? Because religions are supposed to give hope, that's what they do. And if there's no specific thing that's mentioned that you can hope for, then I think we got a problem. And folk will drift away and lose interest. But talking about what is it we're hoping for beyond death in Christianity, there is a problem with that. Is that the Bible actually doesn't provide a clear answer. In fact, it provides several different answers, and all of them are kind of vague. The Bible does not speak with a uniform voice as other religions do. For the Mormons, the Book of Mormon is quite explicit about what happens when you die. There will be a family reunion. The male of the nuclear family, the father, husband, will be the head of the reconstituted nuclear family, and the male will be given a universe to run. And an absolute power, sort of godlike power. And if you're a woman, like a daughter, a sister, a wife, you can only be admitted into heaven if the male patriarch approves of it.
Lee, what's the origin of that?
That belief?
Yes.
Joseph Smith basically made it up. Well, actually, I don't mean to offend Mormons or belittle them, but their belief was the angel Moroni revealed this and a lot of other things to Joseph Smith, who was given golden tablets in which these revelations were recorded, and he read from the golden tablets, and his wife, who couldn't even see them because she was behind a curtain, was taking notes to record what was on the golden tablets, and then when she had finished recording everything, the golden tablets disappeared. Convenient. That was believed to be a direct revelation from God. Now, we don't have anything like that, with a detailed description of how's the family, are you going to have a family reunion? If so, how's it going to be constituted? Who's going to be in charge? Will there be nature, some new kind of nature? If so, what are you supposed to do with it? There's been, so in the Bible and in the history of the Christian tradition, there's been no consensus about that. Catholics have slightly different views than Protestants. Lutherans have different views than Reformed people. And to tell the truth, most individuals are on their own and develop their own view of what heaven will be like. Before we go through the biblical material, I want to give you another question, and answer honestly. I'm going to give you some options as to what you believe. Number one, do you believe that after death, as long as you've been a minimally decent person or a faithful person, your consciousness will be preserved. You'll survive death and have self-awareness, and you will be reunited with your family, friends, who knows how broad that circle of acquaintances will be, but there will be a reconstituted society like the one you knew on earth, and you will enjoy seeing God, and everything will be harmonious forever. That's option one. I'm going to call that's the classic American view of heaven. Option two is your consciousness will survive, but it won't be a family reunion. Instead, you will be enwrapped with the vision of God's glory and beauty and majesty, and you will delight in praising God forever. Okay. Option three is, like option two, your consciousness will survive. There may or may not be a family reunion, but you will be put in committees with like-minded people.
Are we in heaven now?
And you will be given tasks to perform. I don't know, polish the harps, but there will be tasks for all eternity, and you will enjoy and feel ultimate fulfillment through doing them. And the tasks will be corporate. There will be teams.
Calvin definition, yeah.
So that's the third option. The fourth option is your memory of being an individual will disappear, but your energy, your spirit will be reabsorbed into the universe. Like the drop of water returns to the ocean. Next option is, as an individual, your body and anything else that you might have, like a spirit or a soul, will disappear entirely with your demise. There will be no post-mortem survival of you as an individual, but instead you will live on through the impact you had on earth. That your legacy, the influence you've had on your family, on your community, on your church, on your nation, on the world, that you will live on only through that impact. Okay, so again, one is you survive and you have a big family reunion. That's option one. Option two is you survive. I forgot what option two was. You survive and there will be tasks. There will be committees. Option three is you'll survive, but all you'll do is glorify God forever and sing God's praises, and that will bring ultimate fulfillment. I think I just reversed two and three.
You did.
So let's go back. Option one is family reunion. Option two is glorify God. Option three is committees, tasks, work. But you'll enjoy it. You'll feel fulfilled through it. Option four is the drop of water returns to the ocean. You don't remember being an individual, but your energy is reabsorbed by the universe. And the last one is you survive through the impact you had on earth. Okay, how many would go for option one? Continuation of self-consciousness, family reunion.
Hope for that.
Can I go for
Yeah.
one? I don't, you know.
Okay, oh, by the way, what you vote for is what you're gonna get.
Okay, good.
And you take the combo.
You pick a combo. How many would go for one? Okay, that's a good chunk. How many would go for two? Glorify God forever. Nobody. Which makes sense because you're not Roman Catholic. How many would go for three? Committees, tasks. And you call yourselves Presbyterians.
Been there, done that.
I was
Well,
trying to get
that's
away
what
from
John
this.
Calvin taught. That was, and still is, sort of the official Reformed, therefore Presbyterian view. Calvin's ministers, he was head of the sort of like the consistory in Geneva, and the ministers over whom he had charge complained that there were too many committee meetings. And his response was, get used to it.
Yeah, here it
Because
comes.
this is what you're going to be doing for all eternity. So develop a taste for this, that in heaven there will be jobs that God wants to have done, and it will give the elect, the saints, ultimate joy to do them. In fact, many in the past, many Presbyterian pastors said, if heaven is a place of rest, like the Lutherans believe, I don't want to go there. I want to do stuff. And it is the case that for many dyed-in-the-wool Presbyterians and Presbyterian clergy, when they retire, they don't really retire. You know, as long as they're conscious and mobile, this is reported all over the place in gerontological facilities. They keep working, even if nobody wants them to. Maybe they'll go out into the hallway and give sermons, and go into other people's rooms uninvited and give pastoral care. But the notion of, you can relax now. All you have to do is play bingo, and God loves you anyway. They say, no, I want to be busy. I want to do something. So that was option three, and nobody took it. Option four, the drop of water returns to the ocean. Okay, that's the winner. That's the majority view. How about all you do is live on through the impact you've had on earth? Yeah, we got
4 and
close.
5.
Okay, we got
That's
some.
what I did. I spoke,
Okay.
and I hoped for.
Yeah, so we've got a lot of 4s and 5s, some number 1s, and the 2 and 3 were non-existent. Okay, that's I think that pretty much reflects the view of mainline Protestantism in general in the United States. Yeah.
My philosophy is God will take care of it, and I don't really worry about it. And then when I vote for number 1, it's probably because that sounds good. It's not necessarily what's going to happen.
Right. Yeah. And that is an interesting way of phrasing it, that I'm not sure what's going to happen. Whatever it is, it's going to be good. It's going to be fulfilling and satisfying. I'd call that sort of optimistic agnosticism.
Well, I think number 1 helps us get through dying.
Yeah.
You know, thinking that, okay, we are gonna be with people that we love because we're leaving those loved ones, some of those loved ones behind.
Yeah.
So I think that it's a comfort thing, that number 1 for us.
Yeah, and we will look at that. I mean, that is probably the most comforting, depending on your family. But everybody's got some sort of social network that gives them affection and a sense of community. And I will put in a good word for all of these in future times. But for this one, just a preview of coming attractions. Folk who really like the family reunion view say that their argument is who you are, if your individuality is going to survive, who you are is a function of who you've been related to. But without your significant relationships, you're really nobody. You know, it's your relationship to your parents, to your children, to your grandchildren, to your friends, to your siblings, colleagues. It's those significant relationships that constitute your identity. So if your identity is going to survive, those relationships have to survive, or else you wouldn't be you. You know, I wouldn't be me if I hadn't grown up in New Jersey.
Sorry to hear
If I had grown up in Lancaster County, I would have been a nice person. Anything else I'll hand over here?
Yeah, well, it's kind of like I voted for the drop in the water, but I really didn't fit into any of them because I kind of believe that our spirit goes on, but I do believe that the people who have left us, their spirits are still around us.
Yeah.
Is that like like I feel like they're there still looking out for us, warning us.
Yeah, I didn't mention that, but I should. Thank you for, because that's become increasingly popular, and I'll say more about that view actually today. Yeah.
So when we offer sympathy to a friend by saying, well, we know that so-and-so is in a better place, we don't have to define which of these places they are.
Right.
And we just know that any one of the 5 of them is a better place than where they left. That's the idea.
Right. The one that might not be particularly helpful would be to say, your loved one is decomposing and will become grass and flowers.
Yeah, I'm wondering if one of the reasons number 1 might be a more popular choice is because we're taught all through our life we're made in the image of God. So we think God looks like us,
Mm-hmm.
so we relate to everything in a human form, where with the drop of water going back to the ocean has more to do with the sense that our real being is soul and energy, and we see God as soul and energy. So we tend to relate more to that.
Yeah, thank
God
you.
doesn't look like me.
Yeah, because the individual survival, family reunion, that does require a certain amount of what in theology is called anthropomorphism, that personal relationships and personhood as we know it constitutes the universe and is the way God is. That God's a person in the way that we're a person. And it's important to preserve personality. Okay, was there another observation? Okay, we're gonna dive in. But first, I do want to tell a personal anecdote that ties in with this theme of the survival of individuality, personhood, and maybe even family reunions. I started to think about this when I was a little kid. I was 5 years old, and you may remember that in the 50s there was a spate of folk going on vacation to Florida for the first time and bringing little reptiles back, little baby alligators and especially turtles. So I got this little turtle from a relative who had gone to Florida, and I cherished it. It had a little yellow spot on its head. So I saw on TV a show about, it was apocryphal, about alligators flourishing in the sewers of New York City. Because as they had grown, people didn't know what to do with them, so they flushed them down the toilet. And the urban legend was that they liked that, and that sewer maintenance workers were seeing alligators all over the place. And so I was thinking, well, my little turtle isn't happy. It's in this little bowl, and there's a plastic palm tree, and there's some turtle food, and there's some water, and it's probably miserable. I've got my turtle in captivity. So I decided to liberate it. Yeah, you see what's coming. And I flushed it down the toilet. And then a few seconds later, it swam back up.
Wow.
And was, swimming around the surface of the water. And so I thought, go on to freedom, little turtle, and flushed again. And I kept doing that until it didn't come back. And so then my grandmother came home and looked in the empty turtle bowl and said, "Where's your turtle?" And I said, "I liberated it." I didn't say exactly that. I sent it to freedom. And she said, "What did you do?" And I said, I flushed it down the toilet. Then she said, "You killed it." And then I said, "What's that mean?" She said, "That means it's not coming back. It's nowhere. It's gone. You've destroyed it. It's dead." And I thought, oh, that's horrible. And I felt very guilty and sad. But then she said, "Don't worry, we'll get you another turtle." And then I thought, if I died, would they just say, "We'll have another child"? Yeah. Or we can adopt another, so this is no big deal. And I started to cry, and I just said, "I don't want another turtle. I want that turtle. I want the turtle with the little yellow spot on its head. I want the little turtle who used to live in that bowl. I don't want a replacement turtle." And that was, I think, a sense that I had that individual things or individual creatures, and even more so individual people, are irreplaceable. They're not substitutable. So that every individual life has its own integrity, its own value, and you can't find replacements for it. So that's a good word for the first view of family reunion, in survival of personhood. But to turn to the Bible, I'm going to assume that even when we take the Bible to be the Word of God, it's the Word of God filtered through human beings who live in particular cultures, speak the language and have the assumptions of a particular culture. And so in the Bible, which was written over at least a millennia, the cultures changed. And therefore, the way they talked about death and hope, survival beyond death, changed. And it changed radically according to the culture. So here's a thumbnail sketch of how life and death were thought of in biblical times. The earliest ones, the earliest descriptions of death, there seems to be no belief whatsoever in any kind of personal survival. When you're dead, you're dead. Ashes to ashes and dust to dust. And that's what we celebrate on Ash Wednesday, for example. And there was no feeling that personal survival beyond death was necessary, because the general assumption was you live on through your people. You live on through your descendants. which is why genealogies are so important in the Old Testament. You know, your genetic code, they didn't think of that terms, but your personhood is somehow being perpetuated into the future through your children and your grandchildren and your descendants. So having a lot of children was crucial in the Old Testament. And the general theme is, I might die, but that's okay as long as my descendants live on. They live on through my descendants. And if not biological, literal descendants, at least your people, your village, your ethnicity. As long as the Hebrew people survive, I'm good. You know, I can check out. I don't want personal immortality as long as I can reasonably hope that the Hebrew people and our customs and our habits and our values and our scriptures and our rituals will continue. That still is the thing that animates Judaism, big time. You know, as long as Hanukkah, Passover are celebrated, and the same prayers are said that have always been said, and now for some people, and as long as there's a nation of Israel, we're okay. What happens to individuals is not that important, or it's of no importance. All that happens is the survival of our people, our tribe, our way of life. And that is common in cultures that have a strong sense of communal identity, where it's the community that's the important thing. And it's the community you want to see go on into the future, not necessarily individuals. And some very strong communities really don't have much of a sense of individual personal life. I took a class on a cross-cultural trip to Nicaragua once, up in the mountains. It was basically a tribe. There's no roads, no electricity. So it was a very tribal situation. And because it was a trip to explore religious attitudes, we asked the leader, I guess you could call him the mayor of the village, to one of my students said, tell us your faith journey. And so what he did was told the story of the village from the Spanish conquest on. And then the student said, no. Didn't want the history of the village, wanted your personal spiritual history. And then he told the story of the village again. And finally, after several times, he just said to the student, I don't know what you're asking for. You keep asking for my faith development, my spiritual journey, and I've given it to you 4 or 5 times. And then finally it dawned on him, he said, all I am is my village. There's nothing more to me than that. And that really flabbergasted our students. So that was the earliest, in the earliest strata of the Old Testament. That seems to have been the general sensibility. We want the tribes of Israel to survive. What happens to individuals is of little consequence. We want to know that God, Yahweh, will protect us, help us defeat our enemies, and help us prosper in the land in perpetuity. And as long as we can believe that, we're good. Whether you or I die, it doesn't matter that much. What matters is the people will continue. Martin Luther King Jr. actually said something like that. He said, I'm not sure what's going to happen to me. And he knew he was going to get assassinated. He got so many death threats. He knew that sooner or later, one of them was going to be actualized. And he said, I don't really care what happens to me. What I care about is that the civil rights movement will continue. And as long as I believe that, I can depart happy. But there was another strand that developed in ancient Israel, and it was that, I'm going to call it the fading away view. It might be like the survival of the spirit among us, a view that's still strong. And it was that when a person dies, their spirit lingers. It may go to a kind of holding tank called Sheol, which was actually the name of the garbage dump outside Jerusalem. But it might, and that's become the that's become the biblical defense of the notion of hell. But in Hebrew scriptures, it wasn't that. It was a place where spirits went when they died, and they still might have contact with people on earth, living people, still might interact with society. But they were resting in this place called Sheol, where they would fade away eventually. So for a while after death, your spirit would linger, eventually become weaker and weaker and weaker, and then disappear. That's evident in stories in the Old Testament, like King Saul contacting dead people through the witch of Endor. So there was a notion that witches, there were people, witches, who could connect the spirits of the dead with the spirits of the living. And that notion was common throughout the ancient world. Think of Homer's Odyssey, where Odysseus, at one point, descends into Hades to see the spirits of his dead companions from the Trojan War. So he sees Achilles and Ajax, etc. And and he discovers that they're looking pretty weak. They're pale, and they confess that they're having no fun. And that I think Achilles says to him, any menial life on earth is better than this. And they were getting progressively weaker. So that was a common view. But the common denominator is that somewhere, somehow, the spirit lingers for a while. It may grow weaker and disappear, but at least it lingers. That went along with a belief in ghosts. One thing that suggests that there has always been some notion like that when you're biologically dead, you're not just gone in every respect. The fact that in most cultures, not all, but most, the dead were often buried with their goods, grave goods, things you might need in the afterlife. Think of the Egyptian pharaohs, who needed a lot of stuff. And because they were used to being served, needed to be buried with their slaves. Or Celts from the steppes, originally from the steppes of Asia, who were buried with chariots and horses, because that's what you're going to need. Or even in prehistoric times, people being buried with tools, weapons, which you're going to need in the next life. So that notion that our spirit lives on somehow has been fairly widespread. Maybe not universal, but it's very, very widespread, particularly in Eurasian civilizations, from the steppes of Asia to the Celts and to prehistoric people in Europe. And it seems to have been the same thing with indigenous people in North America and actually South and Central America too. So whenever you see people being buried with their stuff, that suggests that there is some kind of belief in an afterlife that will be very much like this, that somehow the spirit will live on and it will need this stuff. Funeral home directors tell me that there's been a renaissance of that people want in their coffins some of their treasured possessions. The most extreme example of that that I heard was a toy train enthusiast who was buried in the coffin with his electric train going around his body, and sort of a long-term battery put in, so it not forever, but at least for a while, he can enjoy his electric train. Or people being buried with their
Animals.
Yeah, their animals, their stuffed animal, or athletic equipment. Yes. a hockey stick. So that theme is widespread, and it continues, and it was found in Scripture. Not so much the grave goods, like you need to be buried with your stuff, but the notion that your spirit somehow or other will survive at least for a while. Now, we have time for an abrupt shift. Things changed. Oh, no, go ahead.
Excuse me, have any churches opined on to restrict cremation because you need the body when you're resurrected?
Yeah, they used to. That not so much anymore, but there had been a lot of antipathy to cremation initially, on the grounds that you will be resurrected in your body, and therefore you have to have a body. Most theologians and denominational leaders thought that was, that belief, that opposition to cremation, was an insult to God. So if God can animate these bones and put vitality and flesh back on these bones, God can reassemble your molecules wherever they are. In fact, this was a problem early on in Christianity, because the early Christians, as we'll see, had a strong sense of physical resurrection. Just as Jesus ascended in his body, the tomb was empty. He wasn't just a disembodied spirit, it was a resurrection of the body. So also we will all be resurrected in the body. And that created some problems. The theologians in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century began to speculate, well, if we're resurrected in our body, I don't really like my body. I'm kind of old and it's falling apart. And so then it was, well, you'll be resurrected in peak performance state. And then the other question was, well, if God's going to reassemble us, including parts that may have been decomposed, what about our fingernails? Will God put all our fingernail clippings back on our fingers? And if so, won't that be kind of unwieldy? Or what about your hair? Will God put all the hair clippings back? And what if you were deformed or had something wrong with your body from the get-go? Will that be fixed? So those became issues about resurrection of the body. But generally, these days, folk who cherish the resurrection of the body as a theme, they generally say, if God can resurrect the body in any way, surely God has the power to find the molecules or create a new body that somehow or other is continuous with your old body but different. And we'll talk more about that next time. Go.
Yeah, 15 minutes.
Okay, good. I have time to introduce quickly one next theme, and then we can talk more. Things changed in biblical times somewhere between the 8th and the 5th century BC, where a strong belief in individual survival became common. And that happened actually at about the same time period throughout the globe. There was a stronger sense of the importance of being an individual and being evaluated by God, or being evaluated by something, maybe karma, but the moral quality of your life was going to be evaluated, and you could either pass the test or not. That occurred in China with the rise of certain forms of Buddhism. It arose in India with the Upanishads. It arose in Greece with Plato and to some extent Socrates. And it arose at the same time in ancient Israel. The notion that our life as a whole is going to be judged. Not our village, not our people, not our nation, but the quality of our own individual life is going to be evaluated. And you could get punished or you could get rewarded. It's not so much that God's going to condemn the whole nation, as happens in the early parts of the Old Testament. You know, if a king does something wrong, everybody gets punished. And this shifted to, no, it's not the corporate entity that's going to be judged, it's individuals. We are going to face something like a last judgment. And that went along with the notion that if you have led a virtuous life, a righteous life, and for Christians that became a life of love, peace, and justice, love, peace, and love, hope, and faith, that went along with the theme that, well, therefore you must survive. Your personhood must survive in order to enjoy the fruits of your good life or receive the punishment for your bad life. And that happened in lots of different religions at about the same time. No one knows why. Often by historians of religion, it's called the axial revolution, meaning the whole axis of religion changed and became much less communal and much more individual. And therefore, people began to cherish the notion that my individuality, my specific personhood, will survive death. And it's not enough just to know that my people will continue, or my genetic code will be perpetuated, or even that I'll be remembered. It's that I want my consciousness and the shape of my life and the direction of my life to be preserved for good or ill. And that became, by the end of the Old Testament period, that became the dominant view. That there is going to be a last judgment. There will be life after death. And for those who are righteous, it will be good. And for those who are not righteous, it will be very, very bad. And so the notions of paradise, hell, developed in the later part of the Old Testament. And in the period after the Old Testament, the intertestamental period between the book of Daniel, which is the latest book in the Old Testament, and the time of Jesus. There's about a 200-300 year stretch there. And in that time period, the Jewish people were hit by a variety of invasions and wars, the most vicious probably being against the Syrians in the time of the Maccabees, which is celebrated with Hanukkah. And the theme developed is those who fell to Syrian persecution or died in battle against the Syrians and to some extent the Greeks, and then later the Romans. Those who were persecuted or been tortured to death or imprisoned or been killed in battle, those martyrs would live forever. So the theme that those who die for the people, the way of life, those individuals will really be blessed in heaven. And then that got expanded to everybody's going to be evaluated, and some people will make it and some people won't. This probably happened because there was not as much identification with the village, with the community, that something had happened almost globally to promote a sense of being an individual, of I'm me, and I'm not like everybody else in New Jersey, and therefore God can't just condemn New Jersey, Lincoln, and therefore include me because I'm part of it. God's going to evaluate everybody according to their own individual merits. And that would set the stage for the New Testament, and that's what we will look at next. So for the last 9 minutes or so, observations, questions? Oh, one thing I do want to say is all these views from the past have survived. So it's not as if any of these have been totally replaced. They've all survived, including the grave goods stuff that I alluded to.
Sort of connected to Mike's observation. I wondered about just being, well, you're saying, what kind of why am I me? But what about those of us who are who want their bodies after death to go to the Humanity Gifts Registry? Okay, so
Yeah.
you know, you're gonna get chopped up and observed and so on and so forth, and then cremated. I'm just wondering about what goes forward from that.
Yeah.
I mean, physical body. It
Yeah.
doesn't matter
Yeah.
at all.
For some, and this has always been the case, God's powerful. If God created you in the first place, and created your body in the first place, God's powerful enough to reassemble the material parts. So even if your eye goes to one person and your heart goes to another person, eschatologically, God can reassemble it. That's one view. The other view is that God's going to give you a kind of replica, something that's recognizable as you, and will have some kind of physical dimensions, but not exactly like this. So I don't know. There'll be a heavenly avatar of yourself, a new body, which, just jumping ahead to next week, that seems to have been the view of the Apostle Paul. There will be a new heaven and a new earth, and you'll get a new body that will be somewhat continuous with your old body, but not exactly. And just as another preview of next week, the example of that is the resurrected body of Jesus, which sometimes could be recognized as Jesus, but sometimes wasn't. Wasn't initially recognized by Mary in the garden, in the Gospel of John, thought he was the gardener. The two disciples on the road to Emmaus, Jesus appeared to them physically, was going to have dinner with them, and they didn't know who he was. They didn't recognize him. But when Jesus shows up in the upper room with the disciples, they know who he is. So there's something, and eventually Mary does realize who he is. So there is some continuity, some recognizability, but not exactly. So the view was Jesus has a new kind of body that can walk through walls. And if you read Luke carefully, can bilocate, because Jesus is talking with the disciples in Jerusalem, and walking with two other disciples to Emmaus. So Jesus is sort of recognizable, but sort of not. Sort of physical, but not the kind of body we have, because it can walk through walls and be in at least two places at the same time. So that's a long answer to your question.
In regards to his question, it seems then the presumption is who I am is my body. And if indeed you don't think you're your body, this is a vessel, I'm inside here, and it's a soul, and it's a spirit, and it's energy.
Yeah.
This doesn't matter. And I kind of pair that with the idea of from dust to dust and ashes to ashes. The idea we don't, it just doesn't matter what
Right.
it looks like or where it is.
Right.
But it's inside, and that's not dismembered at any
Right.
time.
What you pointed to is the underlying issue in regard to this is, can you separate the soul and the body? Or do you believe in what's often called psychosomatic unity, that you and your body are tightly connected? Which some of the ancient Christians did, because they'd say things like, just to the martyrs, or people who are going to face getting thrown to the lions, just as you have suffered in this body, or are about to suffer in this body, you will be resurrected, healed. with something like the same body. And that was, because part of their identity was, I'm a martyr, or I'm gonna be a martyr, and with, you know, the teeth marks of the lions, and that's part of my identity. So my body is not just an appendage or a disposable shell, it's part of me. So that's not a question we're gonna resolve. And Christians have fallen in different ways on that one. Is our body essential to our identity, or do we have a soul that can be disembodied and still remain the same?
We are in part our journey through time. And so these kind of discussions are difficult. And in my case, I have this enormous family, okay? My father was the youngest of 15, my mother the oldest of 6. So I'm related to half the world. And I would watch the family, specific members of it, obsess about genealogy and kind of build this kind of utopian vision of those to whom we are related. And then there was the family that I knew, which had really good people and real bastards. And so for me, it was like, well, you can kind of pick a good line through this, but you know, you're ignoring the other half. And so for me, everything becomes a quandary. But for those who study genealogy, it's an absolutely good pathway.
Right.
And I just leaves me confused.
Right, yeah, and thank you for pointing to the sudden, well, last 10 years, popularity of genealogy.